it is my pleasure to introduce to you our next presenter, Dr. Vicki Crawford. Her topic is the relevance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in our times. Again, another timely message. So I'm ready for this one too. So Vicki Crawford is the Endowed Chair in the Department of Africana Studies and History and Director of the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collection. That's an archive containing over 13,000 writings belonging to Dr. King. Now, as director, she develops teaching and public outreach initiatives that advance the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Crawford is a civil rights scholar whose groundbreaking volume of essays, Women in the Civil Rights Movement, Trailblazers and Torchbearers in 1993, was one of the first publications to address the under-researched role of women in the African American freedom struggle. Currently, she is the general editor of the Morehouse College King Collection series on civil and human rights and co-editor of Reclaiming the Great World House, the global vision of Martin Luther King Jr. That's published by the University of Georgia Press in Athens and published in 2019. She received a Ph.D. degree from Emory University in American Studies and is a graduate of Spelman College and the University of Georgia. Under her leadership, the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collection received a 2018 Governor's Award for the Arts and Humanities. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Vicki Crawford.
I think I make sure I get the slides right.
Okay.
Instead of the back one. So thank you so much for having me. This is great. I've never been to the Georgia Archive, and so this is a great opportunity, and it's good to be able to be here to speak with you this morning. What I thought I'd do is begin, before I talk about what's in the collection, is I thought I would share a little bit about Dr. King's background and upbringing. I know to this group, you all probably already know much of this information, but I will start there, and then I will move forward in talking about what's in the King collection, the Morehouse King collection, and how we are resourcing it in our teaching and our scholarship. So thank you. Let me thank, where's Robin? Is she stepped out for a moment? I want to thank her for the invitation of being here. But as we continue to commemorate the life and legacy of Dr. King throughout January, and we do it at Morehouse for the entire month, had Dr. King lived, you all know he would have been 96 years old. And while he is not here with us, he still remains very close in our public consciousness and very much a resource and an inspiration for people not only in the United States, but all around the world. For example, in the United States alone, there are more than 900 cities with a street named for Dr. King. And we can talk about, how the street was on those streets, and but 900 cities have streets named for Dr. King. There are countless churches named for him, public schools, libraries, museums, community centers, parks, and statues that bear his name. And of course, since 1986, we have observed the Martin Luther King Day as a United States federal holiday. Additionally, a 32-foot granite statue of Dr. King, as you know, the first memorial to an African American, sits on the National Mall, and that opened in 2011. At Morehouse College, Dr. King's alma mater, the Martin Luther King International Chapel, many of you have probably been to that chapel, stands as one of the world's most prominent memorials to him. And we have hundreds of people who come every year to see that memorial and to see that chapel. And King is globally recognized in African and Caribbean countries such as Ghana, Liberia, Mexico, Cuba, Brazil. There are statues in his honor in places like India and Asia and various cities around Europe. These monuments and memorials, I think, are important sites of inspiration and rich historical memory. Yet it's also very important to keep in mind that Dr. King's legacy extends far beyond monuments and memorials. And I just wanted to start, as I said, by sharing a little bit of background about him. He grew up, as you all know, here in Atlanta, Georgia, on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta. Basically growing up relatively comfortable, middle class, middle class, we can talk about what does that mean in terms of the Black community at the time, but in relative comfort. His mother, Alberta Williams King, was a teacher, and his father, Martin Luther King Jr., Sr., was, of course, a minister. He had a sister who recently passed away, I think in the past 3 or 4 years, Christine King Ferris, and a brother, Alfred Daniel, who passed away earlier, about I think 1969. Young King was born in 1929 on the eve of the Great Depression. So he saw people who were in breadlines. I mean, as a child, he was able to witness and had some sense of these class differences. And I think he got a greater sense of that as a Morehouse College student when he would go away, as Morehouse students often did, to work in Connecticut in the tobacco farms. And so that gave him some sense of, conditions for people who were working class people in that sense. He grew up, as I said, to middle class parents, and they tried as best they could to shield him from the worst of segregation. But of course, even as a child, he had a sense of, the fact that African Americans were being oppressed. I mean, there were incidents in his life. If you read his biography, growing up, he was a part of an oratorical contest in Dublin, Georgia, and coming back on the bus, he and his teacher were asked to get up and leave and give up their seat. And he didn't want to do it, but the teacher said, no, we don't want trouble. We're going to just do what they ask us to do. I mean, so there were incidents in his young life and incidents involving his father where he was aware about segregation and about racism as a child. Of course, his father was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, and church was the center of their lives, the King family. Church was it. And so in addition to his own family, he had the extended family of his church family. He went to Booker T. Washington High School, and he left high school, and at 15 years old, he enrolled at Morehouse College. So he was very young. He came to Morehouse at 15. He graduated at 19. He was an early admission student. And Morehouse opened up a whole new world for him. And I love this book, this recent book by historian Jelani Favors. The title of the book, because he really captures what King got at Morehouse and other HBCUs, the great value of the historically Black college experience. And I just want to mention the title, if you haven't seen it, Shelter in a Time of Storm, How Black Colleges Foster Generations of Leadership and Activism. And Jelani Favors, Professor Favors, talks about the second curriculum of the HBCU. I experienced that. And so Dr. King, very much and men of his generation when he was at Morehouse, experienced that part of the college. Not only were their studies in class important, but they were also getting a sense of themselves. I think King said somewhere that it was a place that he felt that he could be free, that he could ask a question, that he did not have to be afraid, that it opened up that kind of space for him intellectually, even at that time in his life. So it was at Morehouse that I think you began to trace and see how he intellectually developed and began later to really flourish, because at Morehouse, he was an average student. He was young. And so a little bit immature probably at that point, but it did open up a whole new world. And of course, the president during Dr. King's time at Morehouse was Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays. And so Dr. Mays had a tremendous impact on young King, and eventually became, as King says, his intellectual and spiritual mentor as an adult. So I want to underscore the importance of Morehouse and that experience in terms of laying an intellectual foundation for him through that second curriculum. He developed this race consciousness there. Some of the teachers, some of his professors were people like Reverend Samuel Williams. Gladstone Chandler taught him English. Of course, Dr. Mays, as I said before, was the president. So you get a sense of who was there. From 1940, Mays was president from 1940 to 1967. It was also at Morehouse where King was first introduced to Gandhi through chapel. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, through chapel and introduced to Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau. So now I'm going to go to, if I can get the clicker right, to talk a bit about what's in the collection that reflects some of this early history that I'm talking about. If I can, not good at it. Well, that's, many of you have probably been in Atlanta to the Burke home. I believe it's closed now. They're doing some renovations, or it might be back open. But that is where he grew up on Auburn Avenue. And when I show that to students, you get a sense of what life was like. I mean, it wasn't the shotgun house. It was a very sizable home and very comfortable. And of course, in the inset there are King's, that's the family. His grandmother, maternal grandmother, lived with him. That's Daddy King, as he was called in the inset, and his mother, and that's a young King at the far end over here on the can't see the over here on the right. In the middle is Christine King, and of course AD on the other side. So here's chapel, and I've talked a bit about it. Morehouse required its students to go to chapel every week. I think they might have had to go every day, but chapel was a requirement. And chapel was the mega classroom, if you would. You know, students were getting a lot of intellectual development and social justice messages and understandings in individual classes, but they also were getting this largely through chapel. And chapel is still a requirement at Morehouse. We call it Crown Forum. We just had one this past week related to Dr. King. But students were required to go to chapel, and it was in chapel that Dr. Mays would bring in front of these students people from all over the world. Eleanor Roosevelt spoke in chapel, and of course, we've got records of some of that in the King collection. Who was in chapel, who spoke, and some transcriptions of what they may have said at the time. But that's the place where King learned about Gandhi, because Dr. Mays had traveled widely, had been to India, and traveled the world, really. He was a national figure. And so he brought many people to chapel for students to learn from these folks at a time in a segregated world. So it opened up all sorts of. Now, what's in the collection? And people often ask me, can you access the collection online? You can access the finding aid online, okay? You can Google and see the different series and see what's in there. But if you're going to actually see the document, you have to come to our reading to the archive. You make an appointment and you come to the archive and you can see the actual collection. It is digitized, the collection, but you have to come there to pull up the whole document. Yeah. So we have his Morehouse transcript that's there. He was an average student. He was not an exceptional student in college. He sort of blossomed by the time he got to Crozier and later went to Boston for his Ph.D. We have the blue books, exam books, and our students get fascinated with that because they're like, what's the blue book? I remember the blue book, and I was an English major, and I would try to write them up, give me 2 or 3 of them in the hopes that I would hit upon something, either keep writing, right? So blue books are something that we have. Lots of class notes and drafts of papers, mini drafts. And that is a fascinating thing about Dr. King and how he worked. He was a very impressive writer, and he would go through multiple drafts of something. He would write on everything too. We've got all sorts of strips of paper that he wrote on envelopes, whatever. He might be at a program and take a note. I think he was on a program at Grinnell College, and on the back of the program, he's writing a note, little notes that eventually become the drum major instinct. But he just wrote on everything. Of course, we know he read voraciously, but we get an opportunity, students do, to see how his ideas evolved, how his ideas went from a tiny little idea, something he may scribble and be thinking, and then it will emerge into a little topic outline, then a full-fledged sentence outline, and then actually a first draft. So it's a great way to teach writing, and our English students find it particularly interesting, and history students. We have the drafts of papers at Crozer, and we have some dissertation materials. And this is what's fascinating to me now is over 1,000 books. He had a personal library, and I am really interested in what he was reading. We do have a list of those books. You can access that online. And he read across all sorts of fields. I mean, he read sociology, psychology. Of course, he read history. He was reading a lot about Africa. At that time, there were a lot of books on Africa. Of course, he read Gandhi. He read about nonviolence. That's an area that he had a lot of books about. Of course, he read the philosophers and theologians. But just to browse the books to see what he was reading has just been very interesting to me. And I'm also interested in the role of librarians of that era, if anybody here is a librarian, and how librarians played a very important role in developing some of what they would call these Negro collections at the time, which is very important because he was reading Black history way back in the 40s, the 50s. So we have the personal library and handwritten note card file, kind of going backwards. This is another image of the note card file. He also had a sermon box. So Dr. King delivered hundreds of sermons, but often he would have a set piece, and this is true of speeches as well, a set piece, and he would sort of, recombine passages and, kind of a set piece that he would work with, but he would change it up, okay? So that these note cards and the sermon box served as a basis for recreating new sermons or recreating a different take on something that he might have had written before. So we have all that material. And of course, the blue books again. This is towards the right over here. You can see a graduation picture. He graduated in 1948. Pictures at graduation. And then you have over here on the other side the cost of tuition for one semester. When he was there at the college, 1948. Wow. Yeah, right. A whopping what?
$93.
Yeah, whopping 90. Not now, not true now.
Oh no.
So, landmark sermons. All the landmark sermons are there. 3 Dimensions of a Complete Life, which of course he preached it. That was his trial sermon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He preached that a lot in the early years. Transformed Nonconformist, and that is a sermon. That's one of my favorite sermons, and that's so relevant today. Transformed Nonconformists don't conform to something that's wrong. Step out.
Can we take a picture?
Oh, sure, you can take a picture of that. Yeah. Loving Your Enemies. These are some of the big sermons, the iconic ones. The Drum Major Instinct, iconic. Our God is Able, A Knock at Midnight. All of those sermons are there in their full entire text. This is an example of what I had in mind when I was talking about how he was a meticulous note taker, and he would outline. And here is a note taken, just some notes about the drum major instinct. And as you can see, that's his handwriting. He's just scribbling. And this ends up eventually into one of these iconic sermons. We have what does it say? We all have the drum major instinct. You know, he's talking about everybody wants to be important. Everybody wants to, I mean, that's the human instinct, you know, but it can be to your detriment, you know, if you're only concerned about yourself. So he goes on to develop that. And it's a lovely sermon about service and concern for others, and not following the crowd, and, you know, be a drum major for justice. And I think that's one of the quotes that's on the statue on the mall, quote from Drum Major Institute. Correspondence is another big section in the King collection. He corresponded with all sorts of world leaders, political figures. You know, you could go through the correspondence, and you can go online and look at the finding aid and just see people are listed alphabetically, who he corresponded with. Now you have to come again to read the actual letter or the correspondence. But the world leaders, literary figures. Langston Hughes was a friend of his, a favorite of his. So there's correspondence with Hughes, and of course James Baldwin, John Steinbeck. You just name it, all sorts of Lillian Smith. He had several letters with Lillian Smith, the Southern writer. Of course, he corresponded with other activists and organizers. There's a lot of that material. Ebenezer Church records, Montgomery bus boycott. I particularly like that section because with the boycott, and students of sociology find this interesting, you can see how it was organized in the early parts of the organization, and how people were mobilized. And so it's a great study in how a mass movement is formulated and how it starts, how they developed a taxi service, you know, an alternative mode of transportation. We were encouraging people to stay off the buses. You get a sense of who was staying off those buses, largely domestic workers who had to, you know, cross town to go to work. It's just very interesting to see how that boycott came together. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, lots of material relative to that. And of course, in the collection is the crown jewel, all the Nobel Prize material. All of that is there. The acceptance speech is there, which is a much shorter version of the Nobel lecture. And we have an essay contest at Morehouse for our students. And I've often used excerpts from the lecture and the acceptance speech as a prompt, as a writing prompt. So that's their correspondence around the Nobel Prize, and just the information relative to the first interracial dinner that was held in Atlanta, Georgia, after King received the prize. And we don't have a lot of artifacts. This is one of the things that we do have, which is the briefcase that he was carrying in Memphis. That is there. And we bring it out for viewings. And you can see what's there. Students they don't know what magic shaving powder is. So what is that? You know, so shaving means a shaving, and you know, Fabergé, they don't know what that is. You know, that fragrance, I remember that. You know, so that was and then he had a pill box and, you know, different things that were there. And he was always reading. He always had reading material with him in the case. We are spending time at Morehouse now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. We are reading Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, and using it as a college-wide read for a faculty who want to adopt that because it's so relevant to us right now. It's almost as if he's speaking to us today in that book. That book was written nearly 60 years ago, and it's still relevant. What he has, his critique of racism and poverty and militarism and violence, and human destruction. So we are reading that book. And of course, this other book on the other side, The Trumpet of Conscience, was published after his death. So what are we doing with the collection since we've acquired it now nearly 20 years ago? Acquired it back in 2006. We have developed this arrangement with University of Georgia Press to publish books based on the collection. We published 4 so far. I understand 1 or 2 are, you know, in the making. But we published a book by Justin Rose on Martin Luther King Jr. and the theory of political service. We published an edited volume by me and Dr. Lewis Baldwin, who is a King scholar, on the global vision of Martin Luther King Jr. And there is a book on the Poor People's Campaign. And so we're looking for manuscripts and we hope to publish more. So publication, scholarship based on collection. We want to do a lot of work with teachers. And this is a slide from one of the workshops we had early on that was sponsored by Beacon Press. And this was a workshop with public school teachers, and we should do more of that, especially now with banning of books and all the constraints we have to try to even teach this history, and they really, have under the gun with it. So I hope we can do more of that. And if you all have any ideas about that, please share how we can reach out and be involved in the community and get teachers in the archive and get students in the archive and get around some of these restraints that we have. So yeah, this one was titled From Ferguson to Freedom Summer. And it was really a very rich experience at the college. This is a slide taken from a quote from Dr. King from a newspaper article that was published while he was a student, a 17-year-old at Morehouse. And the title of the piece was The Purpose of Education. We share that with students all the time because King is writing as a teenager about why you're here. And he's speaking not only to students, but he's speaking to faculty members about an education for critical consciousness. And he says, a function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence alone is not enough. So he's writing this, as a college student and is published in the student newspaper. We use it often with the first year students. And so that's the end of the slideshow that I have for you. I want to pivot now to talk a little bit about where do we go from here, chaos or community, and lift up some of the themes that are in that book. If you have not read it, you should get it and read it now, because it really, as I said, is relevant in today's time. It really speaks to us. And I've recently been lecturing on it, and so wanted to share a bit about what he's saying in the book. Dr. King wrote Where Do We Go From Here in 1967, shortly before he was assassinated. And he wrote the book having experienced over a decade in the movement. There were successes, as you know, there were failures, and there were challenges that were left. And he wrote this book in reflecting back on that period. He rarely had a vacation. I mean, he was working around the clock. His secretary, Dora McDonald, she's, go through the collection, all sorts of, communications with King, and she would answer a lot of the mail. And so it was a rare occasion. I believe she was down in Jamaica for some of that time. He went to Jamaica to have a vacation, and he sort of was able to finish the manuscript for the book. But he was able to reflect back on the movement by 67. And he had a lot, and things were changing, okay, as you know. The shift to Black power was beginning to take place. In the first chapter of the book, he's talking about Black power. He's trying to understand it. Vincent Harding, historian Vincent Harding, who taught at Morehouse back in 2012, shortly before he passed away. He was a good friend of Dr. Harding's, of Dr. King's, and he actually drafted a speech beyond Vietnam. And Vincent Harding there's a communication between King and Vincent Harding, where he's trying to explain to King Black power. And King had a problem with the phrasing, and so he was explaining what the young people are thinking and, trying to educate him about what they wanted. And, folks were, young people were feeling as though we marched, we were nonviolent, we did this, and where did it get us? We're still really dealing with structural racism, we're dealing with capitalism, The inner cities had not changed. King had gone to Chicago and Watts, riot, a rebellion. So the first chapter of Where Do We Go From Here, he's grappling with that and wrestling with, trying to understand this shift. And then he goes on in that book in another couple of chapters to give folks a history lesson, to trace, structural racism in this country back to the founding. And that was very important when this book first came out, to sketch out that whole trajectory of how it came to be. How did we get to where we are in this day and time? And then he talks about the successes of the movement, the legislative successes, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act, it's important, 1965. He's speaking about that. He's addressing the successes of the movement and then the challenges that lie ahead. And what he's saying is that the first phase of the movement, what I think Bayard Rustin would call the classical phase of the American Civil Rights Movement, it was about desegregation. But now once you get past that, then the country's got to really make a commitment, because now you're talking about resources and how you use your resources. And that's going to require what he called a revolution of values. It ain't going to be just, you're going to desegregate the lunch counter and the hotels, and you're going to have to, we're talking about the whole system of the way things are done, and you're going to have to address that, and that is going to require, again, a revolution of values in this country. So he's grappling with that, and the chapter that I really like to teach in this book is the last chapter, called The World House, and he starts that chapter with basically using this metaphor of a big old house. And a family, this is how he starts the chapter. A family inherits a great big house. A large family inherits the house. But the folks can't get along together. They can't get along. And so they're not going to be able to live together if they can't get along. And he likens that to the way we are in the country and the world. If we cannot, get along with one another, we will not be able to live on planet Earth, that this thing will blow up. I mean, it will self-destruct. And so he starts the chapter with that idea that, we are challenged to figure a way to live in this world house, that essentially the survival of all humanity is going to depend on it. And we're kind of in that place now, and he goes on to say, this is the problem of mankind. He says, we have inherited a large house, what he calls a great world house, in which we have to all live together, black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, we must learn somehow to live with each other in peace, he says. And he later notes the ethical demands that this is going to place on people. And he writes, quote, every nation, and he's putting the United States in a global context. And, again, we stress this. He was a global leader. He was very concerned about what was going on, not only in the US, but in South Africa. He never went to South Africa because they never would give him a visa. But when he was on his way to get the Nobel Prize in London, he delivered a speech about South Africa. And so he was very much aware, and there are a lot of materials on this in the King collection, on his correspondence back and forth with South African leaders. He was aware of what was going on there and concerned about it. He says, every nation, he writes, must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind in order to preserve the best in individual societies. This, he says, calls for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation. It is an all-embracing and unconditional love for all people. His notion of the love community. I should say, when he talks about the world house, he uses different phrases to capture that same idea. He will call it the world house, or he'll call it the beloved community. He'll call it one human family, but he's talking about the same concept of humanity. And then he begins in this chapter to address the threats to the world house or the beloved community. He cites these threats as racial and economic injustice. And he's talking about race and class, throughout his life. He never disconnected the two. He cites threats as racial and economic injustice and war and violence and human destruction. And one thing about King is that he was, in my study of King, he was unequivocally a believer in nonviolence. He believed in nonviolence as not just a strategy, because that was a debate in the movement, do you believe in nonviolence strategically, or do you believe in it philosophically as a way of life, or both? He believed in it when he really got into it, not at the very beginning probably, but he believed in it philosophically and very deeply as a way of life, of treating people. King writes that, quote, "The struggle to eliminate the evil of racial injustice constitutes one of the major struggles of our time." This is 1967. One of the major struggles of our time. And one since the civil rights movement in the United States, he writes, is a very special American phenomenon, which must be understood in the light of American history and dealt with in terms of the American situation, he wrote. But on another hand, and more important level, what is happening in the United States is a relatively small part of a world development. So he's saying right then and there that American racism and capitalism is connected to what's going on with fascism. It's connected to what's going on in other parts of the world, in South Africa with apartheid. All of these forms of human domination are interconnected, and they're not just about race. They're about race, and they're about money, and they're about class, about preservation of global capitalism. And he was very articulate about that, back then. So we're hearing, people are writing about it a lot now, but he was writing about this and trying to educate people about it's not just someone doesn't like you, or somebody's trying to segregate you from the lunch counter because of how you look. This thing is about something bigger than this. They're trying to circumvent your, they're preventing you from being achieving, buying a house, acquiring capital, being economically sound, getting a job, as a teacher, this kind of thing, the fundamentals of success as we know it to be in this country. And he talks a lot about, in this chapter and throughout the book, what he calls the triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. He uses that terminology, the triple evils. And as you know, again, he's very much talking about, he has a critique of capitalism and racial capitalism. We know that at the beginning of his life, you see him in support of the bus boycott, and you see him at the end of his life back in Memphis, right, in support of the striking sanitation workers. So he's concerned about workers, okay, and how they're treated, and he writes about it extensively. He gives a lot of speeches to labor unions and a lot of speeches about the plight of workers. And as we know, towards the end of his life, he never really got to experience the Poor People's Campaign because he was assassinated April 4th. But he was organizing with others, SCLC and other organizations, the Poor People's Campaign, which is going to be a massive campaign in Washington, D.C., to protest the plight of poor people in the South and all over the United States. And he didn't get to fully realize that because of his assassination. But he was concerned about the plight of the poor, and he wrote, the time has come for an all-out war against poverty. The rich nations must use their vast resources of wealth to develop the underdeveloped, to school the unschooled, and feed the unfed. Ultimately, King wrote, a great nation is a compassionate nation. No individual or nation can be great if it does not have a concern for the least of these. And I think about that so often when I drive through Atlanta and I see folks in the dead of winter living under the bridges in this city. You know, it's like a tale of two cities. I don't have to tell you. And it's heart-wrenching to see that happening. And I think about what he has to say. And you drive around downtown and that area and you see the tents and, you know, it's everywhere, you know, and most of it's moved to the suburbs. You know, people don't have a place to live, nothing to eat. And we live amidst that. You know, you talk about Atlanta and the rising middle class, the Black Mecca on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you've got this other situation, and you see it. You know, it's downtown Atlanta. And finally, in terms of the triple evils, racism, poverty, the last one being war and militarism, Dr. King addressed the persistence of war and the tendency to resolve global conflicts using violence. All right. And I remember Vincent Harding, historian Vincent Harding, Dr. King's friend and colleague. He came to Morehouse in 2012 and taught a class, small class of students. It was interesting to sit in on his class because he was very pensive and he did not lecture a lot. He taught by raising lots of questions and asking students questions. He sort of taught the history backwards, if you would. In other words, he would talk about something current and then work it backwards and have them come up with he would ask a lot of questions and bring different people to the class. And, you know, I think about, you know, Vincent and what he had to say about these triple evils and about violence. I said earlier that King strongly believed in the power of nonviolence to bring about world peace. And he stated that violence was impractical because it was a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. And a descending spiral ending in destruction for all. And I know that Dr. Vincent would wear around campus a pin, a badge that said, violence is obsolete, you know, and he would get you into a discussion about, you know, why that was so. And, you know, he didn't lecture them, but he would put questions before the students and to have these kinds of discussions. And they did a lot of this in the movement, you know, teaching by discussion and student nonviolent coordinating committee would have meetings and, you know, make decisions by consensus, which took all night, you know, kind of thing, because decision making by consensus, that would take a long time. But giving young people the space to figure things out for themselves. Violence, as I said, King wrote, ends up defeating itself. And it leaves society in a monologue rather than a dialogue. And he concluded the Morehouse chapter with the admonition that a solution to the problems of racial and economic injustice, as well as violence and war, require nothing short of what I said, a revolution of values. And I imagine that's what we will need now. I have no idea how it comes about, but he stated then, we must become less self-oriented and more concerned with one another, more genuinely compassionate, that the path of nonviolence could lead the way towards conflict resolution on an individual basis, as well as in resolving differences between nations. And he warned that, as I mentioned before in other words, that our survival depends on our ability to stay awake or adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant and to face the challenge of change. He has another very important sermon, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. I think about that now. You know how the kids talk about stay woke? Well, he has a sermon title that he preached at the National Cathedral, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. And Dean Lawrence Carter, our Dean of the Chapel, recently, about a week ago, preached at the National Cathedral recently, and he preached and spoke some of these words that King had spoken before. He reminded us of these ideas. And King ends the final chapter of the book by stating, our hope for creative living in this world house that we have inherited lies in our ability to reestablish the moral ends of our lives in personal character and social justice. Without this moral reawakening, we shall destroy ourselves in the misuse of our own instruments. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. We have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. And he ends by saying this may well be mankind's last chance to choose between chaos or community. Yeah, so I'm going to end there with that last book that we really are reading and trying to pour into, because it offers so much to think about and to talk about in the present moment. And so now I want to open up for your questions and for your insight in terms of where do we go from here? What do we need to do? What do we need? How do we need to look at the past? What can we use from King? Who should he be in conversation with today? Yeah. Yes, sir.
So, excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank
First
you.
off, I have the great honor right now of working with Ph.D. doctoral students. I talk a
Well,
lot.
about you over there. I mean, people are talking about, we've never met, but students have mentioned that they're taking your class.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they mentioned it the other day, as a matter of fact. Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
Yes.
So I'm actually, this is an archive that to me because I was part of the move from downtown to here. So thank you for hosting this. Great honor to be here whenever I get to come back. Couple of questions. So first question I have is the archive, is that part of Clark Atlanta University Library or is that like?
Yeah, the archive, and I should have said this, I didn't talk about the acquisition. Morehouse acquired the King Collection in 2006. And it was a collection of material that was going to be auctioned at Sotheby's in New York at an auction. And Mrs. King died. She died in 2006, that same year. And she had this collection at her home. And so rather than the collection go up for auction, days before it was to go to auction, a group of Atlantans, the mayor was Shirley Franklin, she got together with a group of Atlantans, and they, Mrs. Lowry, Ambassador Andrew Young, several other people, and they were able to get the collection and bring it back to Atlanta before it even went to auction, because the fear was to the highest bidder. Who could that be? Who might it be? So they were able to bring it back to Atlanta, and it was gifted to Morehouse as his undergrad alma mater. So we are the owners of the collection. The library, the Atlanta University Robert W. Woodruff Library, the one at Atlanta University, is the custodian of the collection. So it's housed there. So you can go over to the archive, and that's where it is, in the archive of the AUC. And there's a third institution, and that is the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which is in downtown Atlanta, which of course is a museum. That was Shirley Franklin's vision to create a civil rights museum in Atlanta, because of course Atlanta was one of the, movement sites, just like Birmingham, like other places that have a museum. So she had the idea of, and was in the early stages of constructing the museum. So there is a gallery at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, you may have been there, that exhibits rotating exhibition. Right. Well, it's not going to be in the basement anymore. The center has just closed for expansion. It will open back up at the end of the fall semester. It should be open around December maybe before. And they're bringing that gallery up to the main level. And they're expanding with two large wings for classroom space. That's good because it really didn't need to be down there. And the title, and they named the gallery Voice to the Voiceless, and they got that from an Obama speech, but I didn't really like the title of that.
So before I ask the next question, I am blessed with having met Dr. King when I was a very little boy.
Of course.
Involved in New York City politics. And even though it's amazing, I was maybe 3 or 4 years old, but yeah, because my dad reminded me while my dad was alive, I totally have memory of it, right? Little boy, meeting him, he seemed like really big, right?
Very large
in life, right?
Yeah, of course.
So the question I had, reason I left state archives was because I got hired by UCLA to be an administrator at UCLA. So while I was there, I became familiar with the project that's over at USC, which is called Survivors of the Shoah, which are the interviews with the people that survived the tragedy of the Holocaust in Europe. We're at a point in time where the people that, more than a 3 or 4 year old will have memory, people that were adults that knew Dr. King are getting older.
Yeah.
Right, there's a reality check here.
Yeah.
Has there been any effort or any attempt to capture video or oral history of the people that were part of the story of civil rights and Dr. King's life story?
So that's a great question. And it goes back to Dr. Pratt talking about he teaches with oral history and can bring that into the classroom. We've got a lot of oral interviews that have not been transcribed that I just have from Dr. Harding's teaching at Morehouse back when he was teaching there. And we need to get that material into the library because he brought a lot of people to class who are no longer living. He brought C.T. Vivian, he brought Dorothy Cotton. He brought at least 10 people. So there's that. And there's a lot of oral history here and there in different places. But what I hear you maybe saying is there needs to be some sort of really a concentrated effort to develop some extensive oral history project with the people that are here now, because they are passing on day by day by day. And we won't be able to have that insight. So I'm not aware of any current really big initiative like that. Bob, do you know of anything like that?
I would simply say that you can with eyes on the prize.
Yes, absolutely.
I use it in my classes.
Actually worked with that collection.
Great.
So
So
earlier on, it's now, where is it, Washington University?
yeah. I use it, but every time I show it, somebody who was alive then has since passed.
That's right.
So there are very few of those people who are still alive. C.T. Vivian and John Lewis, I think, passed the same day, a couple of years ago. And so they're gradually, John Lewis was 80, C.T. Vivian was 95. They're gradually fading from the scene. But that's a good one. And there are some others that have come up recently. Stanley Nelson did a very good, he's done two, one on the Black Panthers and one on the Freedom Rides.
Okay.
1961, very excellent series. But again, all of those folk now are getting, a lot of those young Panthers, they're in their 80s. And so a lot of those folk are passing on. But to Dr. Crawford's point, what we need now really is another burst of energy to capture the remaining people. I've been working with Fred Gray. Fred Gray was Martin Luther King's personal attorney. And was also the attorney for the Montgomery bus boycott. And was also the attorney for the Black men who were caught up in the Tuskegee Syphilis study. Fred Gray is one of the few that's still alive. He is got to be around 90 now. And so to capture that rich history on film is really the challenge for this current generation. because every day they're leaving.
Maybe we could talk at another time, because I'm actually a strategic partner with organizations now to create preservation, digitization, access, and use of material. I've been a media archivist for the past 30 years.
Well, yeah, let's definitely talk. I mean, it could be an Atlanta University Center initiative. It could something involve the library.
There's funding that I'm.
Well, it's funded, yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. McCray?
Yeah.
I just want to be here. But what scares me is, you know, get an NEH grant, right? You know, but you're right, it needs to be done. I was just thinking, as Dr. Pratt was talking, Judy Richardson was recently at Morehouse, and SNCC, some members of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they are still, some of them are still together, and you can go online, and you might want to do this for your class. So they've created something called the SNCC Digital Gateway. If you Google it, we could bring it up right here if somebody knows how to do it. Yeah, we can bring it up because they've done a lot of work in terms of, you know, identifying grassroots people in the South, names we may not all know, but they've done some work with that. Judy Richardson and the other person who works for, I forget her name, she works for public television or has had a career in public TV.
Is it
SNCC. Yeah, have you been on it? Who's been on that? Yeah, you got it. You just came up. Yeah. And recently I was in a workshop with them, and this is very helpful. Yeah. Yeah, let's go through that a little bit. Let's go to Our Voices and see what does it turn. This is a whole website, you know, that you can, there's Bob Moses, for example. I mean, all of these people, Bob Moses came to Morehouse when Dr. Harding was there. He's gone. I mean, there's just so many. And here, what they've done is that a lot of SNCC workers worked in the Deep South in places like Alabama and Mississippi. So they've got a lot. If you go to Strong People, a lot of information about grassroots folks in small local communities, local people. And it's a rich resource. Keep going.
Where's the space?
This is digital.
No, who created?
Oh, created this. A group of SNCC people, Judy Richardson, who else is a part of the group? Do I want to say Ivanhoe Donaldson? Let me see who's there. Let's see, people. I know Judy's a part of it. And this is just a whole list of names that young people may not have ever heard of. And some of them were interviewed, not all. I'm trying to see who else is a part of this group.
So this was
Marion-
profit.
Yes, and they're still adding to it.
Okay.
And they meet often, all right? And they go around and they give lectures, and I just can't think of some of the other names associated with it. But I know Charlie Cobb is associated with it, if you've heard his name, out of Alabama. He wrote a book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. That's the title of one book. Charlie Cobb was the originator of one of the early thinkers about freedom schools and the freedom school movement down in Mississippi, teaching young people what they were not going to learn in school. They couldn't go to school for the whole school term because of sharecropping. So this is an example of what you're talking about. But a lot of these people have passed on.
Yeah, exactly. That's where.
Yeah, so I don't, if we can raise money and
That was the whole thing behind the survivors of the show, because, that's what, 20, 30 years earlier than civil rights, right, 1920s. So Steven Spielberg recognized that, okay, we need to capture these people's voices before we can, right? And it's part of life, unfortunately, is then you can't tell the story anymore, right? So it's really critically important. And the beauty of it is through Claire grant, an NEH grant, or maybe this even becomes part of the discussion within the state. There's opportunity here to capture these voices while we still can.
he was first. Oh, okay. Let me get that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
until you can get like the funding that you all are talking about, what would you suggest for amateurs? Like if I'm trying to, capture oral history from my family or from the small town that I'm from, that's, how do
You can, for those of educators, we can do this as a part of the class. I
Yeah,
mean, you can do this in your teaching.
Yeah.
And create projects and bring them together. And everything's digitized now. I guess if I were going out doing oral history now, I wouldn't know what to do because when I was doing it, I had a tape recorder. I don't even know what you do. What do they use? Telephones? I gotta go to the oral history workshop. Yeah. I have no idea.
There's already a resource available called Story.
Oh, storm. See, I don't even know about all that.
And
So I need to be educated about that. I mean, going out doing now.
my mother to WADE and they allowed me to record her. I questioned her about her life, her growing up years. They did all of the recording for me and provided me with copies that all of our family now has. We still have my mother's voice and their story for people to, and they often push those stories out to the Library of Congress to retain.
So Atlanta History Center, the booth is now at Atlanta History Center for StoryCorps. The lady from Atlanta History Center had to go.
It's bad.
So
It's all.
did they take it off? StoryCorps or Atlanta?
It's always been, it's been around forever.
Yeah,
I did
thought-
hers. I did hers probably 15, 16 years ago.
But the veterans is still going on because the lady who I was at the table with, she still does the Veterans Oral History Project. Yeah.
And also OGS has received information from PBS that they are looking for people to record their stories.
Yeah.
So if you're interested, I can send you the information. If you write down your email, I can.
StoryCorps also has tape recorders that you're allowed to borrow. And they're like $1,000 tape recorder. So we did it in Fayette County when we were going around interviewing women who midwives or children of midwives.
I would just like to add very briefly that when you are familiar with the Slave Narratives projects, this was part of the New Deal. And of course, that's together historians, sociologists, anthropologists all across the country to go to the South to conduct interviews with the last generation of Black people who were slaves. And that was at a time when there was at least some interest by the government in preserving the memories and the histories of the former slaves. We now have a regime in power
Exactly.
that has no interest in this stuff.
And that's what's scary.
So it's going to become incumbent upon us to do that for ourselves.
Great point. And maybe churches could get involved in it. I mean, some of these churches got vast resources. I mean, churches could do it.
Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Yes. And they're having freedom schools. It's in the national conference will be here in Atlanta in September this year. And there is a local committee that's trying to get it together, and they want to reach out to average people, K-12. You're at Clark, so your department chair is on the committee.
Oh, sure, okay.
So yeah,
I'm
so
doing
they're
it.
looking for people. Yeah, the association.
What department?
The Black History.
African American Life and History. ASLH.
Oh, yeah, you want to be at that conference. Oh, yeah.
ASALH.
So you say September this year?
Yes.
Put it to the fund.
And they're looking for people to link with K-12, your local representatives, and to help develop the freedom school project. So we can keep the study going through churches and local institutions. Also, for another resource, Karen Stanford, I think she's in California, and she's doing oral histories on, so I focus on Black Power, and there's a sort of an imbalance. And a lot of the Black Power information we have is about Panther and not as much about people in other groups. And so she's working on people who work in other groups. And so she has stuff online on YouTube that you can find oral history of people who were in other cultural nationalist in particular groups in Black Power.
Wasn't just.
It wasn't.
Oral histories and it's an African-American history makers.
Yeah, history makers,
Yeah.
They've done a lot of work.
They did a lot.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things I'm gonna show the students is the tech talk. What are they, TED Talks?
TED Talks.
The women that organized that whole thing.
Okay, great. I haven't seen that.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Yes. Any more questions or we at time?
Yeah, we're at
Paper. Yeah, we got to
Well, we can talk because we're,
Okay.
we can go ahead and close out.
Okay.
And you, I mean,
We
we
have
have.
to take it up later. You want to take hers?
Yeah.
She had one.
I'll be quick. When we were talking about this, after the past election, I'm very concerned with that audience out there who knows nothing about any of this. I talked about the audience probably for our young people who go by just splurts out there on the internet. My son-in-law has people that knows that he was astonished, he's in his 30s, that they came back, well, Donald Trump and Republicans aren't so bad because, they were the ones who freed the slaves. And I think this to us. My concern is it worked. Misinformation.
It's working. It's working, yeah.
That is working. It is work.
It is working.
That misinformation. So that is an audience of young African-American people. This is an African-American.
Oh, yeah.
It works. So I'm concerned. Unfortunately, I don't have any answers for it,
Yeah.
but that is a big concern because all of this likelihood, that group of people is not going to go out there and see and recognize all that we have put out there to prove whatever we are saying, which I think it's great. This is something you have to do. But a concern that I have, which I'll say, I don't have the answer for, but I think should be in our mind is how we don't want to lose that. That's a generation that they don't know, they are just co-opting Dr. King to be what they want him to be.
Parties on the holiday.
Yeah. So that's a concern.
Well, I share your concern and disinformation and misinformation is a part of a regime strategy. That's a part of the playbook. It's, that's there. That's how the regime also continues to advance what it's doing. I know a lot of young people, I say to myself, less scrolling, more reading, because that's all they're doing constantly. They're in class doing it. I don't know. I mean, scrolling and getting information from social media. And, a lot of it is, misinformation and it's propaganda. I mean, but it's attractive for them. So
That's how, and my son-in-law was like,
how do we interrupt that?
but I don't know everything that came between.
That's why our teaching is important and teaching in colleges and schools and teaching outside of those structures.
That's right.
That's why all that's important. So I'm gonna stop there. I know you guys are. You could stop. Yeah. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.